I think I know most of everyone. For those that I don't know, my name is Vanessa Turiatunga. I'm the Research and Information Coordinator for the Religion in a Complex Future project, Non-Religion in a Complex Future project, which has organized the event along with Lori in her capacity as Canada Research Chair in Religious Diversity and Social Change. Building Bridges is an ongoing seminar series that we've had, usually hosted at the University of Ottawa in person, which has now obviously moved to the online space. The series was kind of designed to showcase the work of scholars working in the area of religion and non-religion, and to provide the opportunity for especially students, but also postdocs and other researchers to learn from the work and engage with fellow scholars. So I am pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Jacqui Frost, who is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Religion and Public Life program at the Department of Sociology at Rice University. Her research is grounded in cultural sociology with a focus on the causes and consequences of religious disaffiliation in the US and the ways that identity, community, and ritual have been transformed by modernizing processes. Her research has been published in the American Sociological Review, Social Currents, Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, and Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly. Jacqui Frost received her PhD in sociology from the University of Minnesota in June 2020, and the data for her talk today actually comes out of that work that she did in her dissertation. Her talk today is titled Ritualizing Nonreligion, Cultivating Rational Rituals in Non-Religious Spaces. Jacqui, thank you for joining us, and I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lori and Vanessa, and for all of you having me and for being here. So I'm going to quickly share my screen with you all. Okay, so yeah, thank you all for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk with you all about my ongoing work with non-religious communities and hopefully get your feedback on what I'm sort of turning into a journal article that I'm working on that's based on the dissertation work that you'll hear about today. So I won't reintroduce myself. Vanessa did a great job, but I'm in Houston, Texas in the US, working at Rice University as a postdoctoral research fellow. And I'm currently working on turning my dissertation project into a book. So in addition to talking about my work directly today, I know many of you are grad students, and I'm happy to talk more generally about sort of how to think about writing journal articles versus dissertations versus books, because what I'm talking about today is sort of pieces of it are going in all three forms. So I'm learning a lot about the differences between all of these different kinds of academic writing right now. So happy to sort of have a conversation about that too, if anyone's interested. So I'll start with a short overview of my dissertation project more generally, and then I'll segue into a more specific discussion of one of the chapters that I have in my dissertation on ritualizing non-religion for the majority of the presentation. So I'm currently working on turning this chapter into a journal article. So while it is sort of a complete chapter in some ways, it's also still sort of a work in progress as I try to rework it into journal article format. So I'll definitely be interested in not only answering questions that you all have, but if you have any feedback on ways that I can improve this or sharpen it, I definitely welcome any of that kind of feedback as well. Okay, so I'll start with a short vignette from my dissertation fieldwork. On a sunny Sunday morning in May of 2015, a group of over 80 atheists and agnostics gathered in a basement at a Presbyterian church in Atlanta, Georgia. As individuals in groups of 2 and 3 trickled in, a band was setting up in the front of the room. At 9 a.m. sharp, the band gathered the room's attention, and soon everyone in the basement was belting out the lyrics to the theme song from the 1980s comedy Ghostbusters. Some sang, clapped, and danced in the aisles, while others laughed sheepishly and followed along by reading the lyrics displayed on the large overhead behind the band. The band was equipped with a saxophone, a piano, a guitar, and both lead and backup vocals, and they quickly orchestrated a call and response dynamic with the audience during the choruses. When the band asked, "Who you gonna call?" the audience yelled back gleefully, "Ghostbusters!" Everyone was on their feet and smiling, looking around at their neighbors with knowing glances that signaled shared memories of the movie and the irony of singing about ghosts at a gathering devoted to celebrating atheism. So the occasion for this secular sing-along was the second annual International Conference of the Sunday Assembly, which is pictured here on the slide, which is a network of atheist churches whose leaders intentionally and only slightly ironically appropriate the Protestant church model, including collective singing, in order to affirm secular values and build community among the non-religious. Organizers and members from various local chapters had come to meet one another, share questions and concerns, and celebrate their successes as a growing organization of over 50 local chapters across the globe. Energies were high as conference attendees participated in 3 days of workshops meant to help them improve and grow their local assemblies, and we started each day of the conference with a pop song sing-along similar to the one I just described. So in my dissertation, I investigated the seeming paradox of an atheist church like the Sunday Assembly. Why would atheists, who are by definition without theism, want to start a network of churches to celebrate and ritualize their lack of religion? Answering this question requires investigating not just the Sunday Assembly itself, but also investigating our commonly shared assumptions about what it means to be an atheist and why it seems paradoxical that atheists would create a church-like community. In many of our foundational social scientific theories and in our public discourse as well, there's this widely shared belief that the loss of religion is a largely negative experience that comes with an inevitable loss of meaning, morality, and community. These assumptions stem from our dominant understandings of the causes and consequences of larger social forces like modernization, which are largely based in what sociologist Charles Taylor called a subtraction story. A story of moving away from stable social identities, communities, and religious beliefs, and moving toward a sort of hollow and meaningless secular modernity that leaves individuals feeling uncertain, anomic, and socially isolated. So for example, secularization is a key component of modernization, and many argue that modern societies become less religious over time. This has resulted in what Max Weber called a disenchantment of the world, or what Peter Berger called the problem of meaninglessness that is argued to be brought about by increased rationalization and the decline in rituals and traditions that is assumed to come with a decline in religion. Others, like Anthony Giddens and Margaret Archer, describe the loss of certainty and identity coherence that comes with modernization. They argue that there has been an increase in the abstract systems and competing logics that individuals have to navigate in the modern world, and the increased reflexivity that this requires is argued to leave individuals with little guidance for developing moral and meaningful identities. Scholars have also raised concerns about the loss of social trust, civic engagement, and community that many see as the result of modernizing and secularizing forces. These concerns can be found among scholars like Robert Bellah and Robert Putnam, who've pointed to declining religiosity and increasing individualism in the United States as key factors leading to overall declines in social trust and civic engagement among Americans. So despite numerous critiques and extensions of this subtraction story of modernization and secularization, its core assumptions still shape important debates among social scientists about identity and community in contemporary societies. And equally important, these stories typically go beyond simply describing these societal changes from an objective lens. They often also come with normative claims about whether these changes are good or bad for individual and societal well-being. And these normative claims have in many ways shaped research on and theorizing about non-religious people in particular, as the decline of religion is argued to be one of the central dynamics leading to these various losses that I've just described. So an important consequence of these subtraction stories then is that they have helped to create a largely negative image of the contemporary non-religious person, particularly atheists and agnostics, as being emotionally shallow, overly rationalist and individualist, and in sort of this ultimately unfulfilling search for meaning and belonging. And so this common conception of atheism and other forms of non-religious identity as simply a lack of identity and beliefs is, I think, illustrated perfectly in this comic strip, where the joke is that atheists could never go door-to-door proselytizing their beliefs like many religious groups do, because the assumption is that they have no beliefs or agendas to proselytize in the first place. So this is definitely funny, but it's also a great representation of how atheism and other forms of non-religion are framed, both in our theoretical narratives and much of our public discourse. And this discourse has had really negative consequences for non-religious people. In the United States, for example, where religion still plays a dominant role in social and political life, and where a majority of people are still religious, these stereotypes about the amoral, antisocial, and anomic atheist drive distrust of and discrimination against the growing non-religious demographic. In recent studies, atheists have been found to be one of the most distrusted and disliked minority groups in the United States. And many Americans conflate being religious with being a good person and being a good citizen, which contributes to the stigmatization of non-religious people. And so one of the main goals of my dissertation was to offer a counter to this narrative of non-religious disengagement and meaninglessness. So to do so, I conducted an ethnographic case study of an atheist church called the Sunday Assembly. Local chapters of this organization meet on Sundays, they sing songs and listen to speakers, and they have small group meetings throughout the week. The Sunday Assembly motto is to help non-religious people to live better, help often, and wonder more. And as you can see in a graphic that dominates their promotional materials at the bottom of the slide here, the Sunday Assembly is all about taking the supernatural out of the congregational form, infusing it with science, and spicing it up with pop song sing-alongs. Some of their favorites include Bon Jovi's It's My Life and the theme song from Cheers called Where Everybody Knows Your Name. They also aim to be radically inclusive, intentionally borrowing from aspects of religious practice, as well as welcoming all interested non-religious and religious participants to their services. And they are explicitly non-hierarchical, and there is no one leader or pastor-like figure that runs the organization. So from March 2014 to August 2017, I was engaged in regular participant observation with the Minneapolis, Minnesota chapter of this organization. I attended their Sunday services, many of their social events, and most of their organizational meetings where decisions about the organization were made. I also interviewed 25 of the Minneapolis assemblers as part of my fieldwork. And in addition to this ethnographic and interview data, I also have access to over 5,000 emails from the larger organization's email forum, in which members and organizers from assemblies all over the world engage in online discussions about the goals and the structure of the organization. And then finally, I attended the Sunday Assembly conference in Atlanta in 2015, which I described at the beginning of the presentation, where I met numerous organizers from other chapters in the United States and the United Kingdom, and I spoke to and listened to the founders speak about the organization and its goals. And then finally, in addition to my case study of the Sunday Assembly, in 2017 and 2018, I interviewed 25 non-religious people in the Minneapolis region that did not attend the Sunday Assembly, many of whom did not participate in any non-religious organizations of any kind. This is because the majority of research on the non-religious tends to focus on people who join these kinds of groups, but most non-religious people in the United States, at least, don't actually attend any sort of non-religious organizational gathering. So I interviewed 25 people who I call non-religious non-assemblers that identified as non-religious in some way, but that did not participate in the Sunday Assembly or non-religious groups like it, to sort of expand on my central case study and gain a wider variety of perspectives from non-religious people. So in one of my dissertation chapters that I'm now reworking into a standalone journal article, I investigate the discourses around ritual in the ways that both Sunday assemblers and non-assemblers think about rituals and how many of them are creating secular rituals as a way of cultivating community connections and a secular sense of spirituality in their lives. So before I get into my data on this topic, I wanted to do a bit more framing around social scientific research on ritual and what I'm hoping my data can add to these conversations. So I'll start by defining what I mean by ritual. So there's no universally agreed upon definition of ritual, and the study of ritual has been approached from a variety of perspectives. But a definition that is largely agreed upon is that ritualization is the intentional distinguishing of a certain act or set of actions as distinct from other ways of acting, and the act of imbuing those acts with special meaning and purpose. So sociologist Catherine Bell identifies many different types of rituals, including rites of passage, calendrical rites, rites of affliction, and political rituals. And she outlines some of the characteristics found in most rituals, including formalism, traditionalism, sacral symbolism, and performance. Some rituals explicitly appeal to supernatural beings or forces, whereas others simply govern the rules of an action or set of actions, like sports or warfare. All rituals, however, require some level of performance, the deliberate, self-conscious doing of highly symbolic actions in public. And while some scholars see rituals as being largely about groups acting together, others include solitary rituals and the routinization of an individual's daily activities in their definition of ritual. And rituals play an important role in human societies. Rituals have been found to enable increased social cohesion, to provide meaningful structures for important life events and the passage of time, and to mobilize individuals to participate in religious and political movements that shape our institutions and the distribution of resources. However, there are ongoing debates about the role of ritual in modern society and whether or not meaningful rituals will be lost to secularization and the increased scientific rationalism that is believed to be brought about by modernizing processes. So in one camp are those who argue that humans are naturally ritualistic, and they believe that ritualization will always be a primary mechanism for making meaning and for organizing group life. So for example, Driver suggests that humans are naturally ritualistic. The human choice is not whether to ritualize, but when, how, where, and why. Similarly, Quack argues that humans are ceremonial animals that have a biological ritual sense. And scholars building from a Durkheimian theory of ritual, like Randall Collins, for example, argue that not only are humans naturally ritualistic, but that we will always seek out intense collective rituals because the strongest human pleasures come from being fully and bodily absorbed in deeply synchronized social interaction. In the other camp are those who argue that ritualization has receded in modernity. Catherine Bell, for example, explains that modernization and secularization are often correlated with the displacement of ritual because rituals are considered to be irrational and religious and thus at odds with the scientific rationalism of modernity. Scholars in this camp suggest that in pre-modern societies, rituals bound people together at a societal level and created social solidarity, while in modern societies, rituals are either absent altogether or they retreat from the public sphere and remain relevant only to religious subgroups. And these scholars often express concerns that this loss of traditional rituals has negative consequences for modern individuals, and that the absence of ritual in modern contexts removes an important psychological prop to the individual's capacity to cope with life transitions and to create meaningful identities. And while there are many social scientists who argue that modern individuals find new ways to create meaning and ritual in modernity, it's often assumed that these modern rituals and meaning systems are somehow less meaningful than the more traditional rituals that you would find in religions. For example, Reed and Adams argue that modern individuals attempt to replace the rituals and meaning systems they have lost. However, they say that this has resulted in the creation of sort of a multitude of competing meaning systems that lack the holistic organization that past traditions and religious rituals once provided. So they contend that this leaves modern individuals invested with a longing that can never be fully satisfied. Similar assumptions come from scholars like Eliade, who argues that attempts to find meaning in modernity will always be transient and tragic, and Taylor, who argues that the modern condition is characterized by the fragility of meaning and the felt flatness of modern attempts to create new meanings. So in this paper, I interrogate both of these lines of thinking about the role of ritual in modernity. I show how at the Sunday Assembly, atheists are drawing on scientific research and methods to create new rituals, often through repurposing religious rituals in order to cultivate collective effervescence, transcendent experiences, and what they call secular spirituality. Through a detailed ethnographic account of the ways that Sunday Assemblers are working together to construct rituals and secular spiritual experiences based in rational scientific worldviews, I disrupt this presumed dichotomy between rationality and ritual. And rather than being flat, tragic, or fragile, I show how these rational rituals are often seen by non-religious people as being more meaningful than traditional religious rituals because of the work that goes into their creation. However, I also interrogate assumptions that humans are naturally ritualistic and that everyone is drawn to intense collective rituals. While many non-religious people, particularly Sunday Assemblers, are drawn to rituals and intense group interactions, others are not. And some non-religious people express a dislike or even a distrust of these sort of highly intense communal rituals. This does not mean, however, that these non-religious people are somehow lacking in meaningful experiences or that they live this tragic or unfulfilling life, as many of our social scientific narratives seem to assert. Often non-religious people's dislike of religion or of ritual stems from negative experiences with religious rituals in their past, and their becoming non-religious meant being freed from what they saw as harmful groupthink or the pressure to conform in these sort of ritual spaces. So in short, I argue that the non-religious are not exempt from the human need to make meaning out of their experiences. They don't live meaningless lives because of their lack of religion, and I find that they instead live lives in pursuit of wonder, emotional connection, and transcendence. And part of this meaning-making process for many non-religious people involves ritualization. So a great example of this comes from one of the workshops that I attended at the Sunday Assembly Conference in Atlanta in 2015. The workshop was titled Secular Spirituality, and it was run by the Sunday Assembly founder, Sanderson Jones. At the beginning of the workshop, Sanderson talked about how he experienced an intense awe and wonder for life, but in a completely secular way. He explained that despite secular people's aversion to the word spiritual, he was hoping that Sunday Assembly could work toward developing a language for and practices surrounding a secular spirituality that was devoid of any reference to the supernatural. So the goal of the workshop, Sanderson explained, was to work as a group to start fleshing out what a secular spirituality might look like and to develop some practices that local Sunday Assembly chapters could use to elicit secular spiritual experiences at their assemblies. So for the first half of the session, attendees, including myself, focused on coming up with words and phrases to describe their secular spiritual experiences that did not rely on the language of spirituality as a way to be inclusive of non-religious people who dislike the word spiritual. And we talked about words like interconnectedness, transcendence, effervescence, and consciousness. Then the group was asked to join Sanderson in attempting to cultivate a secular spiritual experience in that very workshop. We first tried humming at a low volume together while people who felt compelled stood up to testify about something positive in their lives. And then we tried clapping in unison while looking intentionally into each other's eyes. When Jones suggested we try this, he said, "Research shows that when people move or sing synchronously, they become more open to new ideas. And by clapping in unison and looking each other in the eyes, we can trick ourselves into releasing oxytocin. So in theory, we should be able to elicit these feelings of spirituality and transcendence whenever we want." So these attempts at cultivating spirituality on the spot in the workshop were largely unsuccessful and fairly awkward. But Jones and many of the assemblers in attendance agreed that if they relied on scientific research and followed the right formula in a sort of trial and error fashion, they could eventually cultivate feelings of transcendence and collective effervescence in their Sunday Assembly services. So these attempts to create rituals that would elicit spiritual experiences were common among the Sunday Assembly chapters. For example, the science behind clapping synchronously as a means of cultivating secular spirituality and community, as well as other collective ritual activities like communal singing or communal dancing, were a common topic of conversation among Sunday assemblers. One of the key components of a Sunday Assembly service is the pop song sing-alongs, which were intentionally included because scientific research has shown collective singing to be effective at producing heightened emotions and bonding people into communities. Some Sunday Assembly chapters also tried to rework the religious liturgical calendar to help them ritualize seasonal change in a more secular way. So in what came to be called secular seasons, depicted in the image on the left here, the idea was to map the Sunday Assembly motto of live better, help often, and wonder more onto the calendrical year. They explained how this season of help often occurs in the summer when it's easier to get out and volunteer. The season of wonder more aligns with the transition into fall and winter, which coincides with the start of school and time for more learning. And the season of live better aligns with a time when people are making New Year's resolutions to improve their lives. And a few chapters started what they called ritual labs and ritual retreats, where assemblers met once a week to experiment with what they called rational rituals. Their goal was to create new rituals that worked in their small groups and then figure out how to scale them up to work at larger Sunday Assembly services. So the idea that a ritual, something assumed to be irrational and religious, could be created in a lab, a space imbued with rationality and science, is a perfect example of how the non-religious often combine religious and scientific language to create new rituals in ways that run counter to dominant assumptions that rationality and ritual are at odds. The approach to ritual creation at the Sunday Assembly that I have been describing is very much based in a sort of trial and error mentality. Based in their scientific understanding of how certain kinds of rituals can induce spiritual experiences, the non-religious people I encountered in my fieldwork often approached ritual creation like they would approach a research study. Grounded in an extensive review of the literature and through trial and error, they have faith that the scientific method will guide them toward a successful set of ritual practices if they follow the right formula. And this runs counter to our dominant sociological understandings of how rituals work and what happens when they fail. Scholars of ritual like Catherine Bell and Randall Collins tend to argue from a Durkheimian perspective in which a ritual cannot be successful if too much rational thinking is applied to it. And they argue that a successful ritual is one that is taken for granted and that leaves individuals feeling stronger and more connected to the social group. And Collins argues that individuals are naturally drawn to successful rituals that increase their emotional energy, and they naturally avoid weak or failed rituals because they drain emotional energy. So I think that failed rituals can certainly turn someone off of seeking out a similar ritual in the future, but I found a very different understanding of ritual creation and ritual failure among the non-religious people in my study. Rather than avoiding ritual failure or taking rituals for granted, non-religious people at the Sunday Assembly were trying to create what they called rational rituals, and they often expected ritual failure and attributed it to their trial and error approach to ritual creation. Like the largely failed attempts at the secular spirituality workshop to create effective rituals on the spot, I found that ritual failure did not always result in the rejection of these rituals or a sense of drained emotional energy. Instead, failure was expected, and the idea was to keep working at a ritual and continuously fine-tuning it until it produced the desired outcome. And importantly, these fine-tuned rituals were not seen as any less meaningful, and they were often seen as being more meaningful because of the work that went into their production. So another example of this trial and error approach to ritual comes from the Minneapolis Sunday Assembly's first Sunday service and the discussions that organizers had sort of before and after. So I started observing the Minneapolis chapter about 3 months before they held their first official Sunday service. So I attended a number of planning meetings and dry runs during the lead up to their first assembly. So for the first 3 months after its founding, much of the work that the Minneapolis assemblers did was spread the word about the Sunday Assembly and prepare for their first Sunday service. The model for what that service should look like was handed down from the founding chapter in London, and Minneapolis organizers worked to find a space to hold their services, put a band together, and find speakers. So after a few planning meetings and an ice cream social to help get the word out, the Minneapolis chapter decided that they were ready to have a sort of soft launch and see how things went. So when I arrived at the first rehearsal for this soft launch, the band was getting ready to start practicing. However, they were struggling to get the song lyrics projected onto the wall due to the technical issues, and the vocalist in the band was struggling to stay in tune during their practice run. As I watched them rehearse, I sat down and talked to an organizer named Amanda about how she was feeling going into the first assembly. She told me that she and the other organizers were nervous and feeling underprepared, but that it would all come together eventually. She said, "Well, we're just getting started and we don't really know what we're doing. But I think after a few trial runs, we will come to something that works and we can be less anxious and just enjoy it." And during one of the band's many pauses to reassure the struggling vocalist, another organizer named Jeff announced loudly, "Remember guys, this is a soft launch. It doesn't have to be perfect the first time." The soft launch itself was a mixture of failures and successes. The band had improved since the rehearsal, but struggled to get people to sing along with them. Most of the people in the attendance did not really know each other, so conversations were awkward. And there was confusion about the purpose of the assembly and the various pieces of the service, including who the guest speaker was and why certain songs had been chosen. A few days after the soft launch, the organizing team got together to debrief and start planning for their next service. Overall, the organizers agreed that it could have gone better, but that there were some good moments, particularly the parts of the service where attendees could socialize with one another, and they felt that they were working towards success. Organizer Jeff said, "We're learning. I believe in the failing forward concept. Failure is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing that can teach us lessons, and we grow from them. Sometimes we're so afraid to get out there and try something and get involved because we might fail, but then you spend your whole life going nowhere and asking what if." The other organizers agreed and even said that the authenticity of what they were doing made it all the more enriching. An organizer named Joseph said, "The genuineness and vulnerability of the speakers and the songs is an awesome element that I don't think people get everywhere. If it's too polished, it's just a show and there is no sense of connection." The organizers talked through ways to improve upon the first attempt, including adding in another meet your neighbor activity near the beginning of the service, since it seemed to be the most successful aspect of their first service. They also talked about how they learned that they have to ask people to stand up for the songs and negotiated whether that felt too much like a church service or not. They decided it would more easily produce the kinds of feelings they were trying to create if everyone was standing and more involved in the singing. They also agreed that some songs worked better than others and that they should be open to adapting the model handed down from London as needed. One of the organizers named Amy said, "Structure is nice and people should know what to expect. But unlike a church, if there is part of the program that's not working or that people don't like, we can get rid of it. The idea is to experiment and see how things go." So taken together, there was this dominant discourse among Sunday assemblers that secular spiritual experiences could be intentionally cultivated with the help of science, and that doing so successfully required practice. So non-religious people are drawing on their commitments to rationality and the scientific method to create religious rituals and to recreate religious rituals in order to produce experiences of transcendence, wonder, and collective effervescence in secular settings. However, I also encountered non-religious people in my fieldwork who were not drawn to these kinds of ritual practices. In contrast to dominant sociological understandings of ritual as being a sort of natural human impulse, some non-religious people are not naturally drawn to ritual activities or transcendent experiences. Atheist and non-assembler Emma explained that her lack of interest in ritual and spirituality in some ways drove her to major in religious studies. And as an undergraduate, she said, "I don't hold any value in those types of things. I'm not sure why. To me, the beauty in non-religion is just the freedom of not having a label or a ritual. It's being able to do absolutely nothing. This is why I ended up majoring in religious studies too, because I saw that something's clearly going on for some people. I feel like I can see it in their facial expressions that something is happening for them. They're having some sort of experience that I was not having." And so I was really intrigued by that, but it was never something I personally experienced or really related to. Similarly, atheist and non-assembler Trista said, "I don't like rituals. I guess there is value in like paying tribute or kind of acknowledging maybe life events, but to me, like ritual is putting significance where there is no significance. It just kind of seems silly to me." And non-religious non-assembler Anna said, "Some people really thrive upon rituals and ceremonies, and I think that's a resource in which people can confide, meet with like-minded folks, feel as though they're not being judged. I've never been a very ritualistic person." So the examples I just described come from non-assemblers whose aversion to ritual meant that they weren't really interested in participating in something like the Sunday Assembly. But there were also debates among Sunday assemblers about whether or not ritual and secular spirituality should be central to Sunday Assembly services. Many assemblers were enthusiastic about ritual creation, but others, like Sunday Assembler Angela, eventually left the organization because of her distaste for the ritualized aspects of the services. Angela initially joined the Sunday Assembly because she wanted a more explicit focus on community that she wasn't finding in other atheist groups in the area. But after a few months of attending the services, she was starting to get uncomfortable with the amount of spiritual language and ritual in the services. She said, "The idea of secular spirituality makes me uncomfortable. I appreciate having a common goal or tradition, but I would hope that we don't assign meanings to them. I don't attend assemblies for spiritual growth. I prefer the assembly to be a fun party that people learn stuff at, not a growing space or Zen center, because those already exist." Assembler John expressed similar feelings about his discomfort with the direction Sunday Assembly was going, saying, "Secular spirituality is not for me. Any sort of spirituality or ritual doesn't appeal to me. It makes me cringe. And I think it's going to be a tough line to walk for Sunday Assembly because it's not an atheist community, it's a secular community. And so how do you enforce the belief of rationality and truth and fact-based belief without being dogmatic about it? Because we don't want to be exclusive, but we don't want to bring in chakras and Reiki. Because at least for me, I don't think that has any place in a secular space. And I don't want Sunday Assembly to be focused on rituals. It feels like an artificial manipulation of the situation." And then finally, not only did I talk to a number of non-religious people who were turned off by rituals and attempts to cultivate secular spiritual experiences, some even described rituals and sort of experiences of collective effervescence as being potentially dangerous. Atheist and non-assembler Sunny said that she was not a ritualistic person because groups of people doing rituals freaked her out. She said, "I get kind of freaked out by that kind of stuff. I feel like there's a mob mentality here in America where if you get enough idiots together, they're going to do something stupid. So I try to avoid the ritualistic because it seems dangerous to me." And atheist and assembler Molly had a similar fear of rituals that stemmed from her upbringing in an evangelical Christian home. She said that religious rituals had always made her feel uncomfortable and that she saw attempts to create collective effervescence as manipulative. She said, "When I was religious, when I would feel, what do you call it, collective effervescence, it always made me feel uncomfortable. It always felt manipulative and fake. So I think Sunday Assembly could create rituals, but I don't necessarily think that it should." So for non-religious people like Sunny and Molly, religious rituals created heightened group boundaries and encouraged people into a mob mentality that they found at best fake and at worst dangerous. So these findings revealed not everyone is in a constant search for high intensity rituals like most of our sociological theories assume, and many non-religious people actively avoid these kinds of rituals. Importantly, though, the non-religious people who were averse to ritual and spirituality did not typically describe their lives as any less meaningful than those who were sort of drawn to these ritual practices. So taken together, I'll sort of conclude the findings that I have in this chapter, and then I'll open it up for Q&A and discussion. So the findings in this chapter disrupt the presumed dichotomies between science and spirituality, ritual and rationality, and atheism and transcendent experiences. Non-religious people do not always reject rituals or spirituality, and this runs counter to dominant assumptions in sociology that the non-religious are anti-ritual and lacking in meaningful discourses and practices. I describe how I encountered a secular spirituality cultivated by rational rituals in which many non-religious people draw explicitly on scientific research and a trial and error method to explain and even intentionally cultivate feelings of awe, wonder, transcendence, and collective effervescence. And I found that failed rituals are not always detrimental to the ritual creation process or to collective effervescence or solidarity. And for many non-religious people, rational secular rituals are more meaningful than religious rituals because of the work that goes into their creation and their ability to recreate those experiences using science. And finally, not all non-religious people are naturally drawn to rituals, as I just described, which runs counter to dominant assumptions that humans are somehow biologically wired for ritual or that everyone enjoys intense collective rituals. This does not mean, however, that they live tragic or unfulfilling lives in search of meaning that they can't find, which is a common stereotype of non-religious people. So taken together, I hope these findings can contribute to discussions in sociology about how rituals work in contemporary societies more generally and in non-religious communities more specifically. Thank you. So I will stop sharing and I'll open this up to discussion. Again, I'm happy to answer questions about the project, but I'm also happy to sort of get feedback from you all on anything that was unclear, any way to sort of sharpen these ideas as I work this into a journal article. So whatever you all feel like talking about is cool with me.
And can I ask that if you do have a question or comment, just type in the chat, just the word question, so that we're not all unmuting and trying to speak at the same time. And thank you, Jacqui, for the talk.
You're welcome.
Super interesting. I do want to go into a room and sing pop songs with people right now. Like that's essentially what I'm feeling.
Thank you, Jacqui. That was great. Super interesting research. I have a question kind of about the use of the spiritual language, like transcendence and awe. It kind of seems to me that they're not being defined as religious or non-religious, but these terms as a concept still seem to be very much influenced by Christianity or religion, like being in awe of God, that kind of transcendence as being above us. I'm just wondering if that kind of came up at all in your research, or if you address it, or if I'm just like even projecting Christianity here too much.
Yeah, no, I think I have a couple of responses to that. So the first thing that I think is important and that didn't come up in the presentation, but that I try to deal with in the paper is that obviously the religions that they're borrowing from here are Christian religions, right? So the people that are participating are, I would say, 95% white, middle class. They're in America and the UK for the large part. So they're borrowing from Protestant largely sort of practices and trying to repurpose them for secular purposes, right? So I think they're definitely sort of redefining spirituality, but still have that sort of Christian sort of tinge to it. And a lot of them are coming from Christian past. So a lot of them have left a Christian organization and they sort of use that knowledge to help them recreate this church service. So I think that's definitely an important piece of this, thinking about sort of the demographics of who's doing this. And then in terms of one thing that does come up in terms of how they talk about spirituality, right? So that secular spirituality workshop, a lot of that workshop was people saying, I don't like the word spirituality. I don't want to use it. Let's come up with a different word. They ultimately didn't really come up with a better word. And so they do use this language, but they often talk about, and there's a couple papers published on sort of the difference between horizontal and vertical transcendence. So it's this, a lot of you have probably heard of this, sort of this idea that transcendence isn't necessarily always sort of above. It can be sort of thinking sort of vertically, sort of outside of yourself in terms of transcending into, thinking about yourself as being part of a larger community or being part of the universe. And it's not necessarily always sort of a vertical thinking about there's, heaven versus earth type of transcendence. So if that sort of starts to answer your question.
Oh, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Amy, you have a question?
Thanks. And thank you, Dr. Frost. It's very interesting. I have so many questions, but I'm not going to ask them all in this moment. But one of the ones I'm curious about is, we keep talking about ritual, but I feel like there's a distinction between collective ritual and individual ritual, and you're really looking just at the collective ritual. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on how or if your findings or the conversations that you had would have been different if it was looking at individual as opposed to collective, because of that iterative sort of culture that sort of seems to underpin, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's helpful to hear that you're going that way, because the dissertation chapter absolutely has a whole section on individual versus collective rituals. But in trying to cut it down for a journal article, that's one piece that I'm thinking like, oh, maybe that's another paper or something. Because in sociology, so for example, Randall Collins, for example, he defines rituals as collective action. Most sociologists define rituals as being collective, and it's more kind of social psychologists that will define rituals as also being individual. And so a lot of my work, or a lot of this chapter, at least in the dissertation, was trying to push back against that idea that rituals can only be collective and that we should define rituals only as collective action. I talked to especially the non-assemblers who were very much like, I like rituals, but not collective rituals. Like, I like to meditate, I like to go out into nature by myself. And I have some good data on how a lot of them would talk about how, they thought individual rituals and collective rituals gave them different things. So they could sort of ground themselves in individual rituals and they would transcend with collective rituals, or vice versa. So I think that that's an important thing to think through, like, individual versus collective rituals give people different things, and some people are drawn to some more than others, or neither, right? So yeah, I definitely think that that's an important distinction to make, and you're making me think that maybe it needs to be back in the paper somehow.
Well, thank you very much. Really interesting.
Corey, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. Hey, Jacqui, that was really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is just regarding the demographics of the Sunday Assembly.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious, are the majority of the people in attendance at these congregations from a religious background? Like, have most people left a religion, or is there a high percentage of people who actually never had a religion? And then I guess to follow in with this, like in congregations where there might be a higher percentage of people who have never had a religion, is there less appropriation of religious language, like awe, and I guess like the transcendent and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I only have really qualitative data on here, so I can't give you great percentage breakdowns but in terms of the Minneapolis chapter, but also, I have some knowledge of some of the other chapters, I would say that there is a slightly higher percentage of people who are formally religious, but I encountered a number of people who were never religious, and felt like, like they thought that they had been missing something in church and that they never got to experience that. And so they really were, when they heard of Sunday Assembly, they were like, oh, I've always wanted to know what church was like, but I could never go. So this might be my time to do that. But there were, I think there were ultimately more people who had left religion, missed certain aspects of it. And I think that's especially true of people who organized the chapters. So there was a difference between people who were doing the work to make these happen versus the people that just kind of showed up and participated. And so I think that the organizers often were formally religious, and that really informed how they structured the services, for sure. And so in terms of like differences among the chapters and the languages they were using, I think a lot of it was informed by, so for those of you who aren't familiar with Sunday Assembly, it started in London in 2013 by two comedians who got together, and they were like, oh, we really want to have like sing songs together, was kind of the main idea. And then they kind of jokingly thought that they could, create this church service around it, and it was very popular. And they then created this sort of model that they put online for people to borrow from. And in order to become a sort of accredited Sunday Assembly, you had to have someone come and watch a couple of your services. You had to incorporate a lot of the main components of what they call the Sunday Assembly in order to be a Sunday Assembly. So there was some sort of homogenization in that way in terms of what the language they were using, the format of their services, the songs they would sing. So in that way, I don't think there was a whole lot of difference between, you know, languages of spirituality, but within each congregation, though, there was a lot of disagreement. And especially on the email forum, there was, you know, 100 email chains of, you know, how atheist should we be? How inclusive should we be? How much ritual should we include? And it ultimately, you know, a lot of the chapters ultimately failed because they couldn't come to an agreement, or the New York chapter had a schism because some of them wanted to be more atheistic and less ritualistic. And so they created their own organization. So there was a lot of internal sort of friction around a lot of this.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Lauren.
Yeah, thank you. Like Amy, I also have a ton of questions. I'll just do one more right now. I'm just curious if there's this kind of sense of community that's been created at these Sunday assemblies, if they kind of go beyond that kind of like weekly congregational meeting, or even sort of like the church building itself, in ways that aren't necessarily like exclusive to religion, but I think are often associated with churches. So even things like youth groups, or organized volunteer events. Does anything like that go on?
Yeah, definitely. So they only had actually one Sunday service a month. So a lot of their participation was in sort of weekly, what they called SMOOPs, small groups. So they would do, in the Minneapolis chapter, for example, they had like wine with TED. So they would go to someone's house, watch a TED talk and drink wine. They would do a lot of volunteering. So there's like a monthly, so every month had a theme, and they would try to organize like a volunteering event around that theme each month. They would have trivia nights. They had a lot of potlucks. They did like Thanksgiving dinners together. And what I found, and you know, if y'all want to talk about sort of the complications of being an ethnographer, what I found was, you know, I went to a lot of those outside events, but what I found was they ultimately did become friends more so outside of the church meetings than in them. And that was something that I didn't really get to see as much. So they started to invite each other to their weddings, and things like that I wasn't necessarily invited to because I had this sort of barrier around becoming like close friends with them for various reasons, which sort of hindered, you know, me being able to really see how deep the community relationships were formed. So I think that, yeah, a lot of people ultimately said that they went to the church services on the Sundays in order to be able to go to the stuff elsewhere. Like a lot of people liked the small group events more than the church services. Not everyone, but a lot of them were like, the Sunday thing is just sort of the avenue into the other things, which I think might be true for religious churches as well. But good question.
Thank you.
Amy.
Again, since nobody else, please other people.
Thank you, ask away.
But I'm going to keep filling up space until other people do. Maybe this is an elementary question, or maybe I'm not understanding. I'm interested in what your answer would be, or your response, given the research you've done and your engagement with the community. In short, you know, the conversations around, you know, experiences of transcendence, collective effervescence, you know, we've talked about the language of them, and is it sort of a semantic thing, question mark. But I'm curious, this question of why do people want to have these experiences in the first place in a non-spiritual context? And I think about some of the schisms that you talked about, and some of the ways in which these communities are failing to come together cohesively or collectively. And I'm curious about this whole question of trying to marry ritual with non-religion, in the sense that I'm curious, is this always going to fail because it's a push against rather than a coming together around? You know what I mean? And and how ritual does or doesn't perhaps interface with a positivist coming together, as opposed to we are not that, and yet we're still coming together. I'm not sure that makes a ton of sense, but I'm interested in that. Generally.
No, it definitely makes sense. And I think that's what I think in answering why, you know, I don't know why everyone does. I think one reason is a lot of non-religious people, well, one, you know, they have either were previously religious and they want to sort of replicate those experiences, and they think that they can replicate sort of, collective singing at church. We should be able to replicate that somewhere else, getting that kind of collective effervescence feeling.
Sorry to interrupt, but why? To what end? If there's not, and again, I'm not super religious myself, but why do you want to replicate that experience or have that experience again? I'm just not quite.
Yeah, I think so. A lot of them talk about.
Sure. I'm not asking you to necessarily answer this ridiculous question, but I'm just.
Well, so I have a couple theories as to why. One is sort of pragmatic in perception. So a lot of at least in the US, non-religious people are discriminated against and excluded because they are argued to not have these experiences. And so they're, I think some of them are participating in this because they want to prove that they do have meaningful lives and that they do have meaningful practices. And that's just sort of a very pragmatic, and maybe that's sort of in the background and not their primary reason. A lot of the language at Sunday Assembly is that these experiences are good for your health. So that like getting outside of your everyday, life and sort of trying to have a very emotional experience in the group and sort of with other people is supposed to be good for you. It's supposed to be good for creating communal connections. And so they constantly cite scientific studies that they'll bring them up and say, this research finds that if we have, people who have spiritual experiences tend to be healthier and happier. And so that I think is a lot of the language, at least by like the organizing teams, as to sort of convincing people why they should be participating in this.
Interesting, but divorced from belief in anything.
Well, that's, I think they would argue, and I would argue that, non-belief is as much a belief as belief is, right? So to not believe in, so they have faith in and they believe in, science and rationality and sort of celebrating so I'm also studying now, part of my book project is studying transhumanists, who are sort of a subgroup of non-religious people. They're not always non-religious, but people who sort of believe that science and technology will ultimately help us to defeat death, that we can sort of become immortal using science and technology by uploading your brain to the cloud or by, becoming a robot or whatever it might be. I won't get into all of that. But this idea that at the Sunday Assembly, talking about death is very much like they think that it is so awe-inspiring that like we're just this tiny speck in the universe and that we have such fleeting lives, and that's something that we need to celebrate right now, our life, and celebrate that we somehow became humanity in this crazy universe. And so they're sort of celebrating that idea and trying to find awe and wonder in sort of the insignificance of humans, if that makes sense.
That's helpful.
In that way, that's a belief, I guess I would say.
That's helpful. I work with psychedelics, and so I'm interested.
A lot of them take psychedelics.
That is helpful to know. Maybe we can talk offline about that.
Yeah. Okay. And some of them, I talked to a couple people who do sensory deprivation tanks.
Mm-hmm. Also, yeah.
So for those of you who don't know, they get into salt water, no sight, no sound, no gravity. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff happens too. It's not just these collective rituals.
Amazing. Maybe we can connect up after.
Absolutely. Please email me. Yeah.
Awesome.
We have time for maybe one more question, or Jacqui, if there's something you wanted to ask of the group, something that you were kind of curious about or would like to hear their thoughts about as you kind of develop this into a book.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone found anything confusing, or if anyone has any other questions of like, why didn't you talk about this thing? That's always helpful. But
okay, I think, yeah, Amy, go.
Just in that, why didn't you talk about this one thing?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, you made allusions to it, but the whole question around non-religion, ritual, and race, I think is really interesting. Like it was all the pictures that you did show, like it looked incredibly
very white space, yeah.
So, and not that you didn't include it, but I wonder how much that factors into the work that you're doing or the way that you're couching it.
Yeah, and it's part of, and I don't have, unfortunately, data on non-white, non-religious spaces, but they do exist, and they're very segregated. So I know people who are doing work on sort of Black atheists and Hispanic atheists in the US and how they are very segregated from the white atheist spaces, and that they feel white atheists are sort of keeping them out of their spaces because the non-white spaces really want to focus on social justice and stop focusing so much on being anti-religious, whereas the white spaces are very much centered around like, we're just going to fight against religion, and that's what matters most to us, like getting "In God We Trust" taken off of our money or whatever it might be. And like Black atheists are like, that's not as important to us as like social justice for Black people in general. We don't, you know, our family members are religious, we're not going to shut them out of our lives. So there's a lot of important work to be done there for sure. And I do sort of talk about that, but I don't have data on the other spaces, unfortunately, but I know others who do. If you're interested, I'm happy to send it to you.
We're interested. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you all for the great questions and for listening.
Yeah, we have like 1 more minute left. So let me just take this opportunity to thank you, Jacqui, for this talk and this kind of interactive Q&A session. I hope we all got something from it. And if you want to speak more to Jacqui, I'm sure you can find her on social media.
I'll put my email address in here.
Yeah, and her email address. And we look forward to hearing more about your work in the future. I want to thank also everyone for attending this talk. Please keep a lookout on our website and in your emails for our upcoming events. We would love to have you all attend again. Thank you, everyone, and I'll let you go about your days.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
See you.